every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. Imagine a shadow that moves through the night, unseen, unheard, leaving only terror in its wake. A whisper of fear that spreads through quiet neighborhoods, turning locked doors and drawn curtains into flimsy shields against an unseen menace. For decades, across the sun-drenched landscapes of California, such a shadow existed. It was a presence that defied capture, a phantom that evolved, growing bolder, more brutal, leaving a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. This was not a single, isolated incident, but a sprawling, terrifying campaign of crime that stretched across counties and years, leaving an indelible mark on the collective psyche of a state. The perpetrator was a master of disguise, not in costume, but in his ability to blend seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life, to appear utterly unremarkable while harboring a monstrous secret. He was a ghost in the suburbs, a nightmare made real, and for far too long he was untouchable. Welcome to Anatomy of Crime. Today, we dissect the chilling anatomy of evasion, the decades-long hunt for the man who became known as the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. We will explore not just what he did, but how he managed to elude justice for so long, the meticulous methods he employed to terrorize his victims and confound investigators, and the extraordinary scientific breakthrough that finally brought his reign of terror to an end. This is a story of relentless evil, but also of unwavering determination, of the victim's enduring pain, and the investigator's tireless pursuit of truth, culminating in a capture that redefined the boundaries of cold case forensics. Our journey into the anatomy of this predator begins in the quiet agricultural community of Visalia, California, in the mid-1970s. From April 1974 to December 1975, a series of increasingly bizarre and violent crimes began to plague the town. The perpetrator was dubbed the Visalia Ransacker. His methods were distinct and deeply unsettling, marking the nascent stages of a criminal career that would escalate to unimaginable horrors. He was not a typical burglar. He would often stake out homes, sometimes for weeks, meticulously learning the routines of his targets. He observed patterns of light and darkness, the comings and goings of residents, the presence of pets, and the vulnerabilities of security systems. However rudimentary they might have been in that era, his surveillance was patient, predatory, and precise. He would enter through unlocked windows or doors, or by prying them open with tools, often in the dead of night, moving with a stealth that belied his eventual brutality. Once inside, he would ransack the home, but his ransacking was peculiar. It wasn't just a frantic search for cash or jewels. He would pull out drawers, scatter clothing, and turn over furniture, but he often ignored items of high monetary value. Instead, his motivation seemed to extend beyond mere theft. He appeared to derive a perverse pleasure from the act of intrusion itself, of violating the sanctity of a family's home. He often left behind strange calling cards, like a single shoe or a piece of jewelry placed conspicuously, as if to taunt his victims and assert his presence. He would steal seemingly insignificant items, a single earring, a piggy bank, a book of trading stamps, photographs. These were not items to be pawned. They were trophies, intimate mementos taken to terrorize his victims, to remind them that a stranger had been through their most personal belongings. The ransacker's crimes escalated quickly, moving beyond simple property theft. What began as burglaries soon involved terrifying confrontations with homeowners. He would tie up his victims, and in at least one documented case, he sexually assaulted a victim. His psychological manipulation was a hallmark of his early crimes. He would whisper threats, sometimes in a high-pitched, almost childlike voice, sometimes in a low, guttural growl, creating an atmosphere of utter helplessness and confusion. He was known to take these small, sentimental items from homes, not for their monetary value, but as trophies, or more chillingly, to further terrorize his victims by reminding them of his intimate, violating presence within their most private spaces. The psychological scars he inflicted were often far deeper and more lasting than any material loss. One of the most significant and tragic incidents occurred on September 11, 1975. Claude Snelling, a respected journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, heard a noise in his home around 2 a.m. He went to investigate and found the ransacker in his backyard, attempting to abduct his 16-year-old daughter. Snelling, a father protecting his child, confronted the intruder without hesitation. In a horrifying act of cold-blooded violence, the ransacker shot him twice and fled into the night. Claude Snelling died, murdered in his own carport. This murder marked a terrifying escalation, transforming the ransacker from a mere burglar and predator into a cold-blooded killer. The murder of Claude Snelling sent shockwaves through Visalia, intensifying the fear and the urgency of the police investigation. The community, once relatively peaceful, was now gripped by a palpable sense of terror, a fear that the unseen predator could strike anywhere, at any time. Despite extensive efforts by local law enforcement, including the creation of a dedicated task force, the Visalia ransacker remained elusive. Composite sketches were drawn, based on victim descriptions, depicting a young, athletic white male, often with a distinctive gait or mannerism. Police pursued numerous leads, interviewed countless individuals, and canvassed neighborhoods. But the ransacker seemed to vanish into thin air after each crime. In one dramatic near-miss, a Visalia detective named Bill McGowan, responding to a report of a prowler, spotted a man vaulting a fence. He gave chase and cornered the suspect in a backyard. The man turned, a flashlight beam momentarily blinding the detective, and fired a single shot. The bullet shattered McGowan's flashlight, saving his life. The suspect escaped. What investigators didn't know at the time, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the perpetrator, Joseph James DeAngelo, was intimately familiar with the area, not just as a resident, but as an insider. He had served as a police officer in Exeter, a town. This insider knowledge likely gave him a significant advantage, allowing him to understand police procedures, patrol patterns, and investigative tactics. He knew how to avoid detection because he was one of the detectors. His sudden disappearance from Visalia coincided with his acceptance of a new police job in Auburn, California, in May 1976. The terror in Visalia ceased, but it was merely a prelude to a far more extensive and brutal campaign of crime, a chilling migration of evil that would soon plague new communities. As the Visalia ransacker vanished from the Central Valley, a new wave of terror began to grip the suburbs of Sacramento County. From June 18, 1976, to July 1979, a series of over 50 sexual assaults and home invasions, initially believed to be unrelated, began to escalate with alarming frequency and brutality. The perpetrator was dubbed the East Area Rapist, or EAR. The similarities in modus operandi to the Visalia ransacker were striking, though not immediately recognized by all agencies due to jurisdictional boundaries and the nascent state of criminal profiling. The EAR targeted suburban homes, often single-story houses in middle-class neighborhoods, and his attacks typically occurred at night, under the cover of darkness, mirroring the ransacker's nocturnal habits. He would meticulously scout his targets, sometimes observing them for days or even weeks, learning their routines, the layout of their homes, and the vulnerabilities of their security. This pre-attack surveillance was a hall. He would sometimes break into homes when the residents were away, not to steal, but to learn the layout, unlock a window, or even place his weapons and ligatures in advance. The year's attacks were characterized by an extreme level of planning and psychological cruelty, demonstrating a clear escalation in his predatory behavior. He would often cut phone lines, disable alarm systems, and remove light bulbs to ensure darkness and isolation, effectively severing his victim's connection to the outside world. His preferred method of entry was through unlocked windows or sliding glass doors, or by prying them open with tools, leaving minimal forensic trace. Once inside, he would often wake his victims, usually couples, with the cold press of a gun barrel or the sharp edge of a knife against their skin. He would then tie up the male victim, often forcing the female victim to provide the ligatures, shoelaces, curtain cords, strips of towels. He would then place dishes or other precarious objects on the man's back, whispering a chilling threat. If he heard the dishes rattle, he would kill them both. This sadistic tactic was designed to instill absolute terror and ensure compliance, rendering the male victim utterly helpless and a forced, silent participant in his partner's torment. The female victim would then be sexually assaulted, sometimes repeatedly, over a period of hours, often in different rooms of the house, a prolonged ordeal designed to maximize her suffering and humiliation. The EAR was known for his chilling taunts and bizarre behaviors during the assaults, which further amplified the psychological trauma. He would whisper threats, sometimes using a high-pitched, almost childlike voice, sometimes a low guttural tone, hissing through clenched teeth. This vocal duality created a disorienting and terrifying experience for his victims. He would often spend hours in the homes, a dark, menacing presence in the most intimate of spaces. He would calmly walk to the kitchen, get a drink from the refrigerator, eat leftover food, and rummage through their belongings, demonstrating a perverse sense of entitlement and a complete disregard for his victim's humanity. He would steal small sentimental items, jewelry, photographs, driver's licenses, personal letters. Again, not for their monetary value, but as trophies, as reminders of his intimate, violating presence. And then there were the phone calls. He would sometimes call victims after the attacks, taunting them, reminding them of his presence and their vulnerability, prolonging the psychological torment long after the physical assault had ended. In one famous call, a victim answered the phone to a man whispering, "Is Ray there?" a seemingly innocuous wrong number. But the whisper was familiar, and the victim knew. In other calls, he would breathe heavily into the phone or whisper obscenities, a cruel extension of his control. He even called the police and the media, taunting them, reveling in the chaos he was creating. In one series of bizarre, sobbing calls, he claimed to be the killer, crying and saying he needed help and couldn't stop, a twisted form of manipulation likely designed to sow confusion among investigators. The geographical spread of the EAR's crimes was extensive, demonstrating his mobility and his ability to adapt his hunting grounds. While initially concentrated in Sacramento County, his attacks soon spread to other areas of Northern California, including Stockton, Modesto, Davis, and the San Francisco Bay Area, particularly Concord and San Jose. This expansion demonstrated a calculated strategy to avoid concentrated police efforts and exploit jurisdictional boundaries. Law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed. In the 1970s, police departments operated in silos. There was no centralized computer database for serial crimes, and communication between agencies was often slow and bureaucratic. Multiple task forces were formed involving hundreds of officers from various jurisdictions, but their efforts were hampered by this fragmentation. Composite sketches were widely circulated, depicting a young, athletic white male, often wearing a ski mask. But despite the unprecedented resources dedicated to the hunt, the ear remained a ghost. He left behind little forensic evidence that could definitively identify him, and his meticulous planning ensured he was rarely seen clearly or for long, making eyewitness accounts frustratingly vague. The psychological impact on the communities he terrorized was profound. Residents lived in a constant state of fear. People bought guard dogs, installed elaborate security systems, and slept with weapons by their beds. Gun sales soared. Neighborhood watch meetings were held in packed school auditoriums. The fear was palpable, a suffocating blanket that covered entire neighborhoods, transforming once safe suburban havens into landscapes of anxiety. The ear seemed to thrive on this fear, his crimes becoming more brazen, his taunts more chilling. He was a master manipulator, not just of his victims, but of the entire community, holding them hostage to his unpredictable and brutal whims. The sense of violation extended beyond the immediate victims, affecting the entire social fabric of the affected areas. Joseph James DeAngelo, during this period, was living a chilling double life. He was a police officer in Auburn, a town just outside Sacramento, from 1976 to 1979, the very years the East Area Rapist was most active. He was married, had a child, and presented himself as a respectable member of the community. This ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing horrific crimes under the cover of darkness is a crucial aspect of his anatomy of evasion. His knowledge of police procedures, his understanding of how investigations worked, and his ability to blend in undoubtedly contributed to his prolonged success in evading capture. He knew how to avoid leaving fingerprints, how to disable alarms, how to move through neighborhoods without drawing attention, and how to anticipate police responses. His dismissal from the Auburn Police Department in 1979, after being caught shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent, was a seemingly minor incident that, in hindsight, hinted at a deeper. This dismissal coincided with a significant shift in his criminal activity, both geographically and in its horrifying escalation. The loss of his badge, perhaps, removed a layer of self-imposed restraint or simply forced him to seek new hunting grounds. As the East Area Rapists' attacks in Northern California began to wane in late 1979, a new, more terrifying series of crimes emerged in Southern California. This new perpetrator was initially dubbed the Original Night Stalker, or ONS, to distinguish him from another serial killer, Richard Ramirez, who was also active in California at the time and became known as the Night Stalker. The ONS crimes marked a horrifying escalation in violence. The perpetrator was now not only raping but also murdering his victims, a chilling evolution in his predatory behavior. The psychological profile of the killer suggested a deepening pathology, a need for ultimate control and destruction. The first attack officially linked to this new phase occurred on October 1, 1979, in Goleta, Santa Barbara County. The victims were a couple who were attacked in their home. The perpetrator attempted to rape the female and bind both, but the couple managed to scream for help and escape, forcing him to flee. However, it was a double murder that cemented the terror in Southern California. On December 30, 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were murdered in their Goleta home. The crime scene bore all the hallmarks of the East Area rapist. The victims were tied with ligatures found at the scene. The home was ransacked for trophies, and the attack was meticulously planned. But now, the attacks ended in murder. DNA evidence would later confirm that the ear had evolved into a serial killer, a fact that would only be fully appreciated decades later. The Ons continued his reign of terror across Southern California, targeting homes in Ventura, Orange, and Santa Barbara counties. His modus operandi retained many elements of the ear: meticulous planning, cutting phone lines, entering through unlocked doors or windows, and tying up victims. However, the Ons now consistently included murder in his attacks, often using a blunt instrument or a firearm. He would target couples, sexually assault the female victim, before murdering both. The brutality of these crimes was extreme, leaving communities gripped by an even deeper, more pervasive fear. On March 13, 1980, Charlene and Lyman Smith were bludgeoned to death in their Ventura home. The murder weapon was a fireplace log. Charlene had been raped. Lyman was a prosecutor, just days from being appointed a judge. The killer used an unusual knot, a diamond knot, to tie their wrists, a detail that would become a signature. On August 19, 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington were murdered in their home in Dana Point, Orange County. Again, they were bludgeoned to death. Patrice had been raped. Her father, a wealthy businessman, offered a significant reward for information, but the killer remained a ghost. The attacks continued. Manuela Whithun was raped and murdered in Irvine on February 6, 1981, while her husband was hospitalized. Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez were murdered in Goleta on July 27, 1981. One of the most chilling aspects of the ONS's crimes was his continued psychological manipulation. He would spend hours in the homes, sometimes ransacking them, sometimes eating food, sometimes just sitting and watching his bound victims, savoring their helplessness. He would often return to the scene of previous crimes, or call victims he had previously assaulted in Northern California, further demonstrating his need for control and his sadistic pleasure in their terror. These calls, sometimes just heavy breathing, sometimes whispered threats, were a cruel extension of his power, prolonging the psychological torment for years. The geographical spread of the Ons crimes was significant, indicating his continued mobility and adaptability. He moved between counties, making it incredibly difficult for law enforcement agencies, which were often siloed, to connect the dots. Each jurisdiction investigated its own cases, often unaware of the broader pattern of crimes occurring just miles away. The Orange County Sheriff's Department, for example, might not have had immediate access to the details of a similar crime in Santa Barbara. This lack of interagency communication and a centralized database for serial crimes was a significant factor in his ability to evade capture for so long. The sheer volume of cases, spread across so many different police departments and sheriff's offices, created a fragmented investigative landscape that the killer expertly exploited. The ONS's last known crime occurred on May 4, 1986, in Irvine, Orange County, with the rape and murder of 18-year-old Janelle Cruz. After this, the crimes abruptly ceased, just as he had vanished from Visalia and then from Northern California. The original Night Stalker disappeared. leaving behind a trail of at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 120 burglaries. His sudden cessation of activity left investigators baffled and communities wondering if he had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply decided to stop. Theories abounded. Perhaps he had moved out of state. Perhaps he had been incarcerated for a lesser offense. Or perhaps he had simply burned out, the urges fading with age. The case went cold, becoming one of California's most enduring and terrifying unsolved mysteries, a testament to the killer's chilling ability to vanish without a trace. For decades, the cases of the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, and the original Night Stalker remained cold. The files grew thick with reports, witness statements, and forensic evidence, but no perpetrator was identified. The victims and their families lived with the agonizing burden of unresolved trauma, knowing that the person who had shattered their lives walked free. Law enforcement agencies, despite their best efforts, were stymied by the lack of a definitive lead. The technology of the time simply wasn't advanced enough to connect the disparate crimes across different jurisdictions or to identify a suspect from the limited forensic evidence available. However, a dedicated cadre of investigators refused to let these cases die. Detectives like Paul Holes from Contra Costa County, Carol Daly from the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, and Larry Crompton from the Orange County Sheriff's Department, among many others, became obsessed with finding the perpetrator. They meticulously reviewed old files, re-interviewed witnesses, and kept abreast of new forensic technologies. Their dedication was fueled by a profound sense of duty to the victims and a burning desire to solve one of California's most notorious cold cases. The advent of DNA profiling in the late 1980s and early 1990s provided a glimmer of hope. DNA samples collected from many of the crime scenes, particularly the sexual assaults, had been carefully preserved, often against long odds, in less than ideal storage conditions. When these samples were finally analyzed in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they confirmed what some investigators had long suspected. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were, in fact, this was a monumental breakthrough, consolidating dozens of seemingly disparate crimes into a single, terrifying narrative, giving the investigation a unified focus. The perpetrator, now known to be responsible for a vast array of crimes across California, needed a new, unifying moniker. It was true crime author Michelle McNamara who coined the term Golden State Killer in a 2013 article for Los Angeles Magazine, and later in her posthumously published book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. This name captured the sprawling nature of his crimes and resonated with the public, bringing renewed attention to the cold case. McNamara's tireless research, her meticulous attention to detail, and her passionate advocacy played a crucial role in reigniting public interest and putting pressure on law enforcement to continue their pursuit. She delved into old case files, interviewed detectives, and connected with a community of online sleuths, all dedicated to identifying the killer. She wrote with a chilling poetry, describing the killer as a doodling, mercurial, vicious, and calculating man, someone who operated in the blank and sinister spaces of suburbia. Her work, tragically cut short by her untimely death in 2016, became a powerful force in the eventual resolution of the case, a testament to the impact of dedicated citizen journalism. Her book, completed by her husband Patton Oswalt and her research partners, became a bestseller and kept the case firmly in the public consciousness. Despite the unified identity and the renewed public interest, the Golden State Killer remained elusive. Traditional DNA databases, such as CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which stores DNA profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees, yielded no matches. This meant the killer had never been arrested or convicted for a crime that required his DNA to be entered into the system. The investigation had reached a seemingly insurmountable roadblock. The anatomy of his evasion was proving incredibly resilient, built on his ability to avoid the traditional mechanisms of justice, a testament to his cunning and luck. For years, it seemed, the case would remain unsolved, a permanent stain on the record of California law enforcement. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was not from a traditional police database, but from an innovative and controversial application of a relatively new technology, forensic genetic genealogy. This technique, pioneered by genealogist Barbara Rae-Venter, involved uploading the killer's DNA profile, obtained from crime scene evidence, to public genealogy databases. These databases, like GEDmatch, allow individuals to upload their own DNA profiles from services like 23andMe or AncestryDNA to find relatives and build family trees. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of looking for a direct match to the killer, investigators would look for his relatives, however distant, and then use traditional genealogy to build a family tree that led to him. The process was painstaking and complex, requiring a unique blend of scientific expertise and genealogical detective work. In 2017, investigator Paul Holes, nearing retirement and determined to solve the case, spearheaded this new approach. They uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch. It didn't immediately identify him. Instead, it identified several individuals who shared enough DNA with the killer to be his third, fourth, or even fifth cousins. These were ordinary citizens who had uploaded their DNA out of curiosity about their heritage, unaware they were providing the first breadcrumb on a trail that had been cold for decades. From these distant matches, Rae-Venter and the investigative team, which now included Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert, began the arduous task of building extensive family trees. They worked backward through generations, identifying common ancestors, and then forward, tracing all the descendants of those ancestors. This involved poring over birth certificates, death records, marriage licenses, obituaries, and census data, meticulously constructing intricate family lineages. Every piece of public record became a clue, every name a potential link in the chain. The goal was to narrow down the vast number of potential relatives to a manageable list of suspects. They looked for individuals who fit the known profile of the Golden State Killer, a white male, born between 1940 and 1960, and who had lived in the geographic areas where the crimes occurred during the relevant periods. This process was like solving a massive, multi-generational puzzle, with each piece of genealogical information bringing them closer to the truth. The ethical considerations of using public DNA databases for law enforcement purposes were, and continue to be, a subject of debate, raising questions about genetic privacy versus public safety. However, in this case, the urgency of solving such a heinous series of crimes propelled the investigation forward. After months of dedicated work, meticulously cross-referencing names, dates, and locations, the team narrowed their focus to a handful of individuals. One name, in particular, stood out, a name that had appeared in the periphery of the ear investigation decades earlier. The name Joseph James DeAngelo was not entirely unknown to investigators. He had been a suspect in the ear cases in the late 1970s, primarily due to his background as a police officer in Auburn, which placed him geographically in the area of some of the crimes. However, at the time, there was no definitive evidence to link him, and he had been cleared. Now, with the power of genetic genealogy, his name resurfaced with a new, compelling weight. A ghost from the past returning to haunt the present. The coincidence was chilling, suggesting that the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. A man entrusted with upholding the law while simultaneously breaking it in the most horrific ways imaginable. Joseph James DeAngelo's life, on the surface, appeared unremarkable, a testament to his chilling ability to maintain a double life. Born in 1945 in Bath, New York, he had served in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War, though he later lied about his combat experience, claiming to have served in dangerous theaters he never visited. After his military service, he earned a degree in criminal justice and pursued a career in law enforcement, serving as a police officer in Exeter from 1973 to 1976, and then in Auburn from 1976 to 1979. His time as a police officer, as we've discussed, provided him with invaluable knowledge of police procedures, forensic limitations, and how to avoid detection, knowledge he expertly weaponized in his criminal endeavors. After his dismissal from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting, he worked for nearly 3 decades as a truck mechanic for a Save Mart Supermarkets distribution center in Roseville, retiring in 2010. He was married, though he later separated from his wife, had 3 daughters, and lived in a modest home in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, sometimes gruff man, known for his meticulous lawn care and explosive temper. He was a father, a husband, a grandfather. He was, in essence, the embodiment of the anatomy of a double life. A man who presented a veneer of normalcy while harboring the darkest of secrets, a monster lurking beneath the mundane. Once DeAngelo was identified as the prime suspect through genetic genealogy, investigators initiated a period of intense, covert surveillance. They needed to obtain a fresh DNA sample from him to confirm the match with the crime scene evidence, a crucial step to ensure the integrity of the case. This required careful, discreet work, as any misstep could alert the suspect and jeopardize the entire investigation. On 2 separate occasions, investigators collected discarded items from DeAngelo's property. First, in April 2018, an investigator collected a DNA sample from the door handle of DeAngelo's car while he was inside a Hobby Lobby store. The sample was not enough for a full profile. Days later, they surreptitiously collected a tissue from the trash can he had wheeled to the curb outside his home. These items, seemingly innocuous, held the key to unlocking decades of mystery. The samples were sent to the lab for analysis, a process conducted with the utmost urgency and secrecy. The results were definitive and chilling. The DNA from the discarded tissue was a perfect match to the DNA profile of the Golden State Killer. After more than 4 decades, the Phantom had a name, and the long nightmare was finally nearing its end. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights. Investigators had a warrant and staked out his house. When he walked out of his garage, they moved in. He saw them and retreated back inside, but they apprehended him. According to reports, as he was being taken into custody, the 72-year-old DeAngelo murmured, "I have a roast in the oven." The arrest was a culmination of decades of tireless work by investigators, the enduring pain of victims, and a groundbreaking application of forensic science. The news sent shockwaves across California and the nation. The man who had terrorized so many, who had been a ghost for so long, was finally in custody. The image of the frail elderly man being led away in handcuffs was a stark contrast to the terrifying, athletic figure described by victims decades earlier. A visual representation of the passage of time and the relentless march of justice. The relief felt by victims and investigators alike was immense, a profound sense of closure after so many years of uncertainty and fear. The legal proceedings that followed were complex, given the sheer number of crimes and the multiple jurisdictions involved. DeAngelo was ultimately charged with 13 counts of murder with special circumstances and 13 counts of kidnapping to commit robbery. The evidence against him was overwhelming, primarily the irrefutable DNA match, which linked him directly to numerous crime scenes. Faced with the prospect of a lengthy trial, the emotional toll it would take on the many elderly victims and witnesses, and a likely death sentence, DeAngelo's legal team entered into a plea agreement. This agreement, while controversial for some who sought a full trial, was ultimately seen as a way to ensure a swift and certain conviction, sparing victims the ordeal of testifying and reliving their trauma in open court. On June 29, 2020, in a makeshift courtroom set up in a university ballroom to allow for social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty to all charges. The plea deal spared him the death penalty, but ensured he would spend the rest of his life in prison. During his confession, DeAngelo spoke of an inner personality he called Jerry, an alter ego he claimed had forced him to commit the crimes. He said that when Jerry came out, he was powerless to stop him, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to deflect responsibility that was dismissed by prosecutors and victims as a pathetic, self-serving lie. The plea hearing was a harrowing event, a moment of profound reckoning. Over several days in August 2020, dozens of survivors and relatives delivered powerful, emotional victim impact statements, finally having the opportunity to confront their tormentor. Their words painted a vivid picture of the profound and lasting damage caused by his reign of terror. Gay and Bob Hardwick, attacked in 1978, spoke of the lingering trauma. Chris Pedretti, attacked at age 15, addressed him directly. "You were a healthy, handsome man with a wife who loved you and a baby on the way. I was a child. You had a choice. I didn't." The daughter of murder victim Lyman Smith said, "The defendant, DeAngelo, is a sociopath with no conscience. He is the definition of a parasite." They spoke of lost innocence, shattered trust, and the enduring psychological scars that had shaped their lives for over 40 years. DeAngelo, sitting impassively in a wheelchair, offered a brief, mumbled statement, read by his attorney. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." For many, it was an insincere, hollow gesture from a man who had shown no mercy. On August 21, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge, Michael Bowman, stated unequivocally that DeAngelo would die in prison. Justice, after more than 40 years, had finally been served, bringing a measure of peace to those who had suffered so greatly. The case of the Golden State Killer is a profound study in the anatomy of evasion and the anatomy of persistence. For decades, DeAngelo's meticulous planning, his chilling ability to adapt his methods, his intimate knowledge of police procedures, gained from within their own ranks, and his profound capacity to lead a double life, allowed him to operate as a phantom. He was a master of psychological warfare, leaving behind not just physical destruction, but deep, enduring psychological scars on individuals and entire communities. His crimes represent a dark chapter in California's history, a period when fear permeated the suburban landscape, forever altering the sense of safety and security for a generation. Yet his capture also represents a triumph of human ingenuity and unwavering dedication. The relentless pursuit by investigators, who refused to let these cases fade into obscurity, combined with the groundbreaking application of forensic genetic genealogy, ultimately dismantled his anatomy of evasion. This case forever changed cold case investigations, demonstrating the power of combining traditional detective work with cutting-edge science. It offered a glimmer of hope to countless victims of unsolved crimes, proving that even the most elusive predators can eventually be brought to justice. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, methodical unraveling of a family tree, a scientific triumph born from the simple human desire to know one's roots. It proved that even the most carefully constructed facade of normalcy cannot forever hide the truth, and that sometimes the secrets we keep are written not just in our minds, but in the very code of our DNA. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.